Hello and welcome to Thrivalism, Interactions podcast dedicated to enhancing the world of work. Today we're honoured to host Andrew Grant. He's the visionary landscape architect behind Grant Associates. Since 1997, Andrew's international design studio has been at the forefront of creative ecological design, addressing climate change, biodiversity and human well-being. His projects fuse environmental harmony with innovative landscape design, and they've earned him the title of the RSA Royal Designer for Industry in 2012. And notably in the same year, his Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, a 54-hectare urban oasis, won the World Architecture Festival's Building Project of the Year, and it's well worth checking out. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. In Bath, he chairs the Bathscape Landscape Partnership and advises the Bath World Heritage Site. He co-founded the Forest of Imagination, which is a festival that reimagines urban spaces and enhances our connection with nature. I think it's fair to say his journey isn't just about design, it's about crafting a better, more natural world for all of us. Super interesting chat. Let's dive straight in. Here's Andrew Grant. Andrew, great to have you on. Let's get straight into it then. I'm really interested in how your upbringing has shaped your perspective on how you approach your work, in particular the landscape and the impact on people. Do you want to talk us through a bit of how those things all gel together?
Yeah, well, I grew up on a farm in East Yorkshire, in a tiny little village. So right from being born, I was immersed in the natural world. And the weather, the seasons, and the life cycles of farms and local wildlife. Although I didn't know it at the time, basically there's building up an enormous memory bank of experiences and things about the natural world and how we occupy that. And so when it came to thinking, what do I want to do I knew I didn't want to be a farmer because I'd got a bit bored of going up and down fields in a tractor.
I would never get bored.
And I started to explore, and I was really interested in art and creative things at school. And I was looking for things that combined my interest in sciences, biology, and the likes, and art. And landscape architecture popped out as a emerging profession at that time. There was only one place you could actually go as an undergraduate in the UK, and that was Edinburgh College of Art and Heriot-Watt University. So I went there from this tiny little rural village into the middle of one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And just from there, it was just fantastic. I just really enjoyed the experience of learning about landscape, about the place of Edinburgh, actually, which is, in my head, it's very similar to Bath. It's a landscape foundation to a place that is really got a lot of power.
I think wherever you stand in both cities, you can see loads of striking landscape from any vantage point. In Edinburgh, it feels a bit more dramatic than in Bath sometimes.
Yes.
But incredible places. And did you feel, coming from a small sort of rural background, did you feel out of place when you arrived there, or was everyone else in the same sort of boat and you're all experiencing it together?
Well, I mean, that's always universities. You end up with a mix of people from different places and different environments. So, yeah, I mean, bit of fish out of water to start with, but you soon get the hang of it.
And when did the outdoors and the seasons and the cycles and the sort of biophilic start seeping into your work, or was that ingrained from the beginning?
Well, obviously, I had that in me. I didn't know what I was going to do with that sort of knowledge and experience in the background, but interestingly, the landscape architecture course at Edinburgh College of Art was run by somebody called David Skinner. Now, he had studied under Ian McHarg, who was a very famous landscape architect who wrote Design with Nature, which is one of those absolute seminal reference books and, ways of thinking about planning and designing in the natural world. So the idea of an ecologically based approach to how you think about the world, how you think about what we're going to do, how we're going to respond to each place, particularly thinking about really understanding the geology, the soils, the drainage patterns, the sort of human cultural footprint on that place, the biodiversity, really coming at each place with that fundamental foundation of knowledge before you start thinking creatively about what you're going to do with that knowledge.
That sounds a lot more in-depth than quite a lot of the stuff that we often consider. I didn't expect to be talking drainage patterns today, but I'm so glad it's come up. And then sort of moving on from that a bit, how did you begin to start, what were your inroads into starting your own practice and setting up Andrew Grant Associates and starting on that journey?
Yeah, well, in the early 90s, I mean, there's the whole discussion about sustainability and the Rio conference and all the rest of it. And I started to get really interested in what it meant for landscape architecture. And I was working for another company here in Bath, Nicholas Pearson Associates, and they had a wide spectrum of people in the office, ecologists and all sorts of people looking at environmental assessments. And I was really interested to know how we could use those skills more creatively in design projects, and started to put feelers out.
Fingers in pies, feelers
absolutely.
out.
Well, it's all about, how many pies can you get your hold of? But yeah, I was just reaching out to sort of lots of really interesting people that I thought were looking at sustainability in an interesting way. And that included engineers and it included architects, particularly locally, Field Clegg Bradley Studios, who basically were pioneering environmental architects and still are. And just, I was just trying to find some relationships. Can we work together? Can we do something around this theme? And there's one particular company called Battle McCarthy who were basically innovating in engineering at the time. They were really challenging architects to produce more environmentally intelligent buildings. And then they started to explore how does that work for master planning of big cities and places. And that started to bring in landscape and biodiversity and drainage patterns and soils and all those things that I was familiar with. So I started working with them. And, that went on to me starting to think I like this is good. And so I decided I would set up my own company. And that was the beginning of an extraordinary journey that we've got to now. So that was over 25 years ago. Now, one of the first projects we did, was the Earth Centre project in Doncaster, which is one of those Millennium projects which was funded by the government and the National Lottery. And it was themed around sustainable development. It was meant to be a fantastic visitor attraction that get people excited about what's the future going to be if we want to live it in a sustainable way. And it allowed us, to develop a landscape that effectively was a test bed for everything we've ever done since, which was really understanding how do we think about, structuring a landscape environment that has more chance of being sustainable, more resilient. So thinking about the soils, how do we get the soils right? How do we get the drainage patterns right? What materials do we use so we're minimizing embodied carbon? How do we create habitats so we've got the most diversity of different species? And just as important, how do we create a space that is beautiful and joyful for people? So, yeah, that was the Earth Centre. And, that was the start of some really extraordinary...
At the time, I guess there are two things that are interesting there. Obviously, those are subjects we talk about quite a lot now, apart from drainage patterns. But at the time, those must seem fairly groundbreaking and fairly progressive. Do you feel not much has moved on in that period, or do you think the conversation has moved on?
I think it's a real mix. I mean, for us, it was groundbreaking because, landscape architecture at the time was pretty much confined to laying out car parks for Sainsbury's and Tesco's all over the country and lots of...
I wish I was back in my truck taking
lots of highways. So that was where I was, that's why I wanted to let's find a way of doing things differently. Interestingly, we keep going back to the Earth Centre now, all these years after, saying, look, what we did there was what we should be doing now. And, everywhere. It's surprising that actually it still is this sort of little outpost of innovation that has not necessarily been picked up very much, or we're still almost at the starting gate, I think, in many projects. I mean, some things have got better. We know that, the way the planning and the design world works now, biodiversity is a word that we have to think about. Biodiversity net gain is something that we have to deliver on projects. We know we have to manage water, rainwater, stormwater, all these sort of things that we need to manage within projects. And we know embodied carbon and materials is something that we need to think seriously about as we go forward. And creating habitat, creating opportunities for different species to sort of inhabit our world with us and not think that we're special or separate. So we're still on a journey, and not enough people are on that track with us.
I feel there's momentum there, though, with all the companies moving towards B Corp and all these topics being more broadly discussed at different levels.
There's no doubt. But I mean, it's really interesting when you start to look at the numbers of people. It's great. There's lots of people starting to get into that sort of intellectual and management process of, we need to demonstrate that we're doing something in an appropriate way. But we're still a tiny, tiny minority in the world of the built environment.
I often think that a lot of that is driven by cynicism as well, because now it's more economically viable, and you work with clients and partners and they demand you're sustainable and therefore you are sustainable. But that's also still a net positive, isn't it? It doesn't really matter what the reasons are behind it.
This is true, yeah.
And if that momentum builds, then that's good. Slightly off topic, I saw a toad last Friday for the first time in years, and I was overjoyed in the built environment. We need more toads. I've got a friend who runs a rewilding business. And I'm fascinated by that. I don't know if that's something you ever touch on. I just wanted to hark back to a point you made a second ago, which is about the sort of the joy and the beauty that bringing some of the natural world, sort of the impact it has on people in those terms. And we talk a lot about, obviously, the workplace and the influence of biophilia in the workplace and people feel calm and well. But one thing we were talking about previously is the more subtle effects of being plugged into nature almost. And when we talk about biophilia and plants in the office and natural light, what do you think are some of the more subtle connections to nature that we miss but are equally as important?
Well, nature is a very diverse environment, isn't it? I think. So you have everything from extreme, let's say, noise of nature and lots of birds flying off and making loads of noise or whatever, or bees or something, all the way through to just quietness and, just immersion in a sort of a very pure sort of environment, I guess. I think it's a really important topic because basically it's about diversity. Everything about nature speaks to diversity. It's about scale. It's about colours. It's about sound. All these sort of things that you think about in the natural world, you have the opportunity to explore how you can use those within, either an office environment or an urban environment. And I think for us, that's really an important part of the thinking process. How do you deliver optimum diversity, which benefits people and biodiversity?
And what are some of the ways you might deliver that on a project? To get down into those sort of details, what does that mean in terms of executing a project?
Every site is different. Every site has its own geology, soils, drainage patterns, all those sort of things. And every site has its own sort of human history in a way. And sometimes it's very minimal, and sometimes it's absolutely drives your response to that because it's so powerful. And I guess, in terms of thinking, well, what are we going to do here? What semblance of nature are we going to recreate? Depends on how we respond to those. So sometimes, in an urban environment, you might say, well, actually, we want to just really optimize the sense of green space and optimize the number of trees, just in a way create separation from the built world. Yeah. Other times you find ways of weaving, of threading, the built environment that we're comfortable with, pathways and shelters and all those sort of things in with natural elements, whether it's, beautiful water bodies or just fantastic displays of flowers or whatever it is. There's just ways of thinking about it in different ways. So, and I think, there's a sort of slightly theatrical approach to landscape design as well, because you want to allow people to go on a journey when they're going through a piece of city or through a park or through a garden. It's not just a one-line thing. As you're moving through it, you've got to sense different things. You've got to sense, all
the layers.
All the layers, absolutely, which similarly applies to the best buildings and the best work environments. There's different experiences that you can have in those.
It sounds like a good point to segue into your work in Singapore. So, because that obviously ties in a few of the themes you were just talking about there. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so our project in Singapore, Gardens by the Bay, which is an extraordinary story in its own right, but it has threads of all those things. I think it was, after the Earth Centre, it was the first big project that we did where we just had the opportunity to push the boundaries again. What does all this mean? So Gardens by the Bay came out as a competition in 2006, and the idea was to create a new public park for Singapore, 54-hectare park, which they wanted to become a tourist destination and a new botanic garden and a great place for local Singaporeans to go. So, we put together a team. So it was not just us, we brought in some fantastic architects, Wilkesnair architects. We brought in some fantastic engineers, Atelier 1, Atelier 10, great graphic designers, experienced designers. And we just went for it. I mean, for us, we were a tiny company.
Yeah, it seems insanely ambitious.
We were about 10 people or something like that. So we just went for it, completely naive in terms of what do you do with a big international competition. Just went for it and made an enormous model, made a fantastic film. Once again, just trying to be innovative in the way we did those. And it did the impact that we wanted, basically.
What was some of the thinking behind what you came up with in the end? What was some of the thinking that guided your entry?
Yeah, there were two things. One was we wanted to test how we could make this garden work as an ecosystem in its own right. So we were looking at all those cycles of water, biodiversity. How do we create a sort of an interesting energy story? Because one of the challenges was, here we are in the tropics, and they wanted air-conditioned glass houses to support various plants from different parts of the world. So having a carbon neutral strategy, a zero carbon strategy for making those work was one of the big challenges that we faced. So creating an ecosystem, but then creating diversity of experiences for people, whether they are big things. And we thought we needed to have some really big things in Singapore, because this was a site that was going to be surrounded by 150, 200 meter high buildings. So we thought it needs some structures in here to have presence and be a focal point. We thought it needed to have some amazing gardens, thematically linked to Singapore. So we quite liked the idea of some cultural gardens which were associated with each of the specific cultures in Singapore, and just scale and drama and just get going, just really make it. I mean, it's clearly become, a very well-known project, and it's been great for us in terms of getting different projects in different parts of the world. But the things that people remember are things like the super trees, which are these significant steel tree-like structures, which we designed to not be visual landmarks, but also they had to have some sort of environmental sort of purpose too. So they're providing shade. They have solar panels on the top that are providing the power. And they're totally clad with vegetation, which provides habitat for all sorts of birds and insects. And the joy and delight thing is they create this most spectacular place. During the day, it is amazing vertical garden with these incredible tropical plants just climbing up to the sky. I mean, the tallest tree is 50 meters, and the smallest is 25. You're super scaled, and we call them super trees because they're just big. And because there's so many of them, in a cluster, you feel you are in a three-dimensional thing. It's not just, there's a tree, big tree, I'm going to look at that. Yeah. It's like I'm in it.
Surrounded.
Part of it. And at nighttime, that really becomes a very important part of the experience, because there's a sound and light show that they put on twice a night. And every night there's sort of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people just gather at this place. Most of them lying on the ground, looking up. But you just feel within, a big sort of extraordinary multi-sensory experience. So once again, it's not, I'm sitting on a bench, I'm looking at something over there that somebody's nicely designed. It's like you are part of it.
Totally immersive. Yeah. Do you go back much?
Yeah, I was there last week. So
just wearing a t-shirt going, I did this, walking around.
Well, it's actually quite emotional actually to go, particularly at night time, to see so many people just going, wow, this is amazing.
And for that not to have waned over the years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pandemic has sort of slowed international visitors down clearly, but the gardens became a real refuge for Singaporeans, to just get out and get into a safe landscape environment.
So from Singapore then to Bath, which is quite the segue. Obviously, we're recording this in the centre of Bath, and both our businesses are based here. And I often feel Bath is a mixed bag, a poison chalice, as it were, because it's insanely beautiful and it's sort of ruined a lot of other architecture for me growing up here. But also due to the history and due to its heritage, often struggles to be progressive and to sort of develop with the times and stuff. Well, I don't know if you share those sentiments. What's your take on our home city?
No, I tend to agree. I mean, I've lived here for over 35 years myself, so I know the challenges that have been and come and continue to face the city. Certainly, I think for Bath to become a future-facing city, some things have got to change in terms of how we accept new development. And I think just having new projects that have a very powerful environmental story of sustainability and embracing nature, even if they're just completely clad in vegetation, for instance, would be an interesting evolution of how this place works. The obsession with classical architecture and things, I find a huge distraction from that, because it's, that's not what we need. We don't need more fake things. However, certain people like that idea. For me, the starting point is the landscape. This is what Bath is founded on. And it's been founded on and colonised by people for thousands of years because of its landscape and because of the environment that it creates for the setting of Bath. And, there's and certainly the use of sort of the local stone, Bath stone, it doesn't have to be done in a classical way. It could be used in all sorts of beautiful ways, I think, to keep that sort of integration of landscape and place. I think there are opportunities to sort of really build on the idea of how do we make Bath a more biodiverse place.
So what would some steps be to do that? If you're in charge, how would you do that?
I think one of the things that we could do in Bath is to really look at, how do we create and build on the sort of network of pathways and connections to the wider countryside that we have here. Because one of the beauties of living in the city, as you appreciate or working in the city, is you look out and you see these fields and hedgerows and woodlands. And I think just sort of making that work easier so that people can just walk out there or find their way, and along those ways, create these ecological corridors. Because basically, the water system of Bath is what drives, in a way, its whole look and feel and ecology. And I think we could do a lot more with just making more of those.
We touched on a couple of points there that I really recognise, I think, because I left Bath and lived in London for a few years. And one of the things that used to make me feel really claustrophobic in London is how hard it was to access green space easily. So, I go to Hampstead Heath, that'll take me an hour. Used to absolutely, on a hot day, just make me occasionally feel really awful. And in Bath, I live at the end of the Two Tunnels cycle route that goes under the hills out of Bath. And looking up from the centre of Bath, seeing a bit of greenery and knowing that I can be there in 20 minutes if I get the needs, feels incredibly soothing and eases a lot of sort of pent-up stress sometimes. And I think those pathways are, great. And there is a couple, aren't there? Like the Two Tunnels is a really good one. But that makes a lot of sense to me in a sort of emotional way as well as an abstract one. That's good. Can we dive into your creative process a little bit? And we touched on it when we talked about the competition entry for Singapore and stuff like that. Yeah. But when you initially get a brief or an idea, how do you start developing ideas and developing out what that looks like as a response?
Well, as I said earlier, basically, there's one part of it which is let's understand the place. So the basic analysis of the site, whether it is all the usual geology, soils, drainage, biodiversity, etc., etc. You need to get a feel for what's it made of and how's it worked through history. But ultimately, there's a moment where you think, okay, we've got to start thinking creatively here in terms of what's our response. And sometimes it can be finding some sort of overarching concept. For Singapore, for instance, we use the concept of the orchid as something, a guiding metaphor for the project. it was the national flower of Singapore, most cosmopolitan plant species in the planet, and it had this two aspects to it. One was the beautiful flowers, and one was its physiology allows it to live in difficult places. So I had the infrastructure and the beauty. So that worked lovely as a sort of an overarching concept. Sometimes you don't have the time or the need to actually have something like that. It's just simply, how do I create a green corridor that goes from here to here, and it carries a
Job done.
pathway, and it's green, green and healthy, and all those sort of things. So yeah, as different projects have different needs.
With the orchid metaphor, was that something that came out of a group discussion, or was that you're sitting in the bath and some ideas come to you, or where did stuff like that develop?
Yeah, well, I mean, with something like Singapore, basically it was, wow, that's a big project. So it was a lot of people kicking about different ideas, and should we do it like this? Should we do it like that? Oh, I like this geometry. But I was keen to sort of find that Singapore connectivity, even though we didn't really understand Singapore that deeply at the time. So yeah, I just liked the idea of that sort of ecological, and it lent itself as a diagram as well. You could imagine the gardens being, the flowers represented the special gardens, and the pathways were the stems. It's as simplistic as that.
Works, yeah.
And it looked, you just drew it. Oh, that, yeah, I like that.
That'll do.
That'll do. Yeah.
So you talked before about your initial ideas around sustainability 23 years ago, and we mentioned how that conversation has moved on, but maybe not as much as you had hoped in that time. What do you see happening over the next 5 years as far as that conversation and that momentum goes?
I think there's a new surge of urgency, certainly within the built environment, is coming through. And that is the recognition that we all need to deal with the climate change aspect. So we need to seriously think about carbon and how that impacts on your project. I think the sense of people's contact with nature is now documented so well, the benefits of that, both from health and well-being, but also from an economic perspective in terms of how people work and how they feel, and they're spending less on the NHS and stuff like that if we have the right sort of environment to live and work in. All of those building blocks are coming together, I think, and I think people are recognizing that this is a must-do, not a nice-to-have option. And I see that we're working for governments in different parts of the world, so you see that at government level, trying to sort of establish statewide strategies that address this, and you see that in commercial developers who see the benefits of creating greener, more beautiful built environments for people, whether it's to live in or to work in. So I'm hopeful. There's still a long way to go to deliver it for everybody, but there's more and more sort of real good examples of projects that demonstrate how you can do it, how we must do it, that I think we've got to stay positive, and I think one day we'll get everybody into that place.
I think that's a beautiful note to wrap up on. Andrew, thank you very much for being on. Thank you.
Thank you.
What an uplifting 30 minutes of vibes that was too. If you enjoyed it, give us a decent rating on your podcast platform of choice. In the meantime, stay tuned. We'll be back soon with the next series of Thrivalism.